Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Fundamentals of Product Ownership Analysis, Scalability. I'm your host, Tiffany Iacolino, and I work on the marketing team at IIBA. IIBA is an independent, not-for-profit professional association serving the global business analysis community. A recognized thought leader dedicated to elevating the discipline of business analysis, we provide our global community with relevant tools, resources, and networking opportunities. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Questions tab in your control panel. We will try to answer some of your questions at the end of the session as time permits. You'll find a special offer in the Handouts tab. Today's webinar recording will be available for a limited time on IIBA's Webinars Archive page within 10 business days of the broadcast. I'm here with your speaker today, Howard Podessa. Howard is a thought leader at the intersection of Agile and business analysis. For over 20 years, he's helped large organizations adapt and optimize their business analysis and planning practices for Agile software development approaches. He's authored books based on these experiences, and he's just completed a new book for Agile BAs and product owners, The Agile Guide for Business Analysis and Planning, from strategic plan to continuous value delivery. At Noble Inc., he's provided Agile and business analysis services to clients all over the world, including ISO, Moody's, the Mayo Clinic, TELUS, TD Bank, the FDA, and others. He is also an in-demand speaker at international BA and Agile events all over the world. In today's webinar, he'll walk us through part 2 of a previous discussion on the fundamentals of product ownership analysis. However, today we'll have a focus on POA at scale. So to start us off, we like to open up with a quick poll. I'll launch a question and you can submit your responses using the voting tool in your control panel. The poll will be open for approximately 1 minute. So I'll go ahead and get that set up. And the question that we're asking today is we always like to get a sense of where you are in your Agile journey. So you can just select one, and our options are you're in your early days, less than 6 months in an Agile organization, currently practicing within 6 months to 3 years, or in deep practice, or deep experience, I should say, and that's more than 3 years. So I see a lot of responses are coming in, and it's always interesting to see the split there. And I'll give it another couple moments to keep those responses coming in. I think we've captured most, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And let's share out those results and see what that looks like. So today we've got the majority, or about, we've got 44% that are currently practicing. A nice split though, and it's nice to see everyone's kind of in a different phase right now. So with that information, let's get started on today's webinar. I'm going to hand the presentation off to Howard to get us started. Hi, Howard.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Tiffany. Can we remove the, oh, there you go. You've already just
anticipated my There we go.
I can just shrink the part that's me here on here. There we go. So thank you very much for inviting me back. This is actually a continuation of a discussion that we had just a short while ago about product owner analysis, and it's just product ownership analysis. And it's turned out that there's been a lot to talk about, and so I kind of split it up so that we would get the fundamentals in the first section, and then today we're going to be focusing on scalability issues. Just a reminder to everyone that we're doing, of course, a very, very tight extraction within an hour of something that can be talked about a lot more. To find out more, this is all extracted from my book, The Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning. It's available at the IIBA bookstore, and I encourage everyone to have a look at it if you're studying up for your certification and so on. The quick connection, the product ownership analysis guide from the IIBA will give you a really good overview of everything that you kind of need to know for that certification. What my book does as a companion is to actually walk you through product development process with the case study and with additional studies added in where necessary. So you can actually see how all the techniques that are talked about in that guide actually do play out over time. And so in the last time we met, for those of you who were there at the first one, we looked at these foundational concepts and practices. And today I want to really focus in on those aspects of the practices that are particularly valuable when you're applying product ownership analysis at scale, in other words, to a large organization. And so we're going to just quickly just give you an idea where we're headed today. I'm going to do a quick overview of the topic and why it is an issue at all, because product ownership analysis at scale, you might think might be the same as product ownership analysis that's not at scale. And we'll look at why you might think that and why that's not the case. Then we'll look at the some enabling practices that are extremely helpful to be effective at Agile at scale. And then we'll zero in on two sides of the coin. One side of the coin is scaling the organization itself. In other words, preparing the organization for a large Agile initiative. By initiative, I mean a program or a very large project. And then we'll look at the other half of that coin, which is the process that is followed by the organization or by the individuals within there. As we'll see, it is not simply just applying Scrum times, many teams. There's a little bit more to it than that. And then because when we're talking about large initiatives, it's often not just the case that there are many teams, it's also the case that it's many teams over a long period of time in order to get the outcomes that you're looking for. Then we also have to look at a planning period that is beyond the sprint, and that's how we get into quarterly planning. And then a few moments at the end, which itself is a full topic too, I wanted to emphasize the importance of getting the culture right. And so we'll look at some of the components of an Agile culture as well to finish off the day. So that's where we're headed, folks. We begin with a little bit of an overview. So just a quick reminder for you about what product ownership and product ownership analysis is. The main point, we covered this last time, but I just want to get the main point across here, which is that product ownership analysis is not some new kind of a role. We're still talking about product owners, a very well-known role. We're talking about business analysts. Product ownership analysis is we can think of as the intersection of those two competencies. Another way of looking at it is it's analysis and planning techniques as applied to an Agile situation. And on this slide here, what I have is this is a slide, if you may recall from the last time, for those of you who were there, I've just developed this map, which basically lays out some of the core techniques, practices, and artifacts, I'll call them in general, the tools of product ownership analysis, and how they play out across the product development lifecycle in Agile. And again, I just want to remind everybody that we're not talking about a waterfall lifecycle. So even though you have a left to right progression, where something appears, where a technique appears, it's just to say that that is where you're going to be most focused on that technique, and it's probably when you're first going to look at that technique. But because we're talking about iterative incremental processes here, you can expect to be dealing with all of these issues throughout the product lifecycle. And what are we focusing on today? You'll see that along the bottom, I have something called the grand lane. That whole lane is for large projects. And so when you're dealing with large projects, we have to look at issues of how the organization is scaled, what we have to do about process, because we may be dealing with long projects. We also pulling out some pieces from that long lane, which is just above it, which is the product roadmap. And then every time we're standing in front of a quarter and we need to plan for that, we'll look at scaled quarterly planning practices. And then on a day-by-day basis, in other words, once development is really underway, there are some continual things that go on. In the short lane up at the top, you'll notice that there is code, build, test, deliver, and so on and so on. This is basically about the continual process of coding, testing, and continually integrating what the changes that are being made across all teams. And we'll look at some techniques like ATDD and BDD that help us do that. And you'll also notice that product owner council meetings, and DevOps is in there as well to help enable Agile at scale. So that's just a brief overview of the techniques. All of these techniques, including the ones that I have not circled right now, they're all in the book, but we're going to focus on the ones that you've seen circled. So I want to begin, I guess, by sort of a brief overview of what the basic, absolute necessary components are to do this successfully. Now, I brought this book in. I remember to bring it in this time. Hope you can see that there. What I have here is it's the Agile Software Development with Scrum book. I love this book. You can see it's very, very well thumbed. I got it when it originally came out, so this is a long time ago. And I only brought that up because that book is actually quite small. If you look at the book that I've just published, The Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning, it's like somewhere around 700 pages versus this one, the original one, which is about 140 something, 150 pages. What's the difference? The difference is that we found out over time that the model that is portrayed in this book, it's a simple Scrum guide, does not scale well without a little extra help. If you're interested in that, I actually recommend you read a book called Failed Squad Goals, or sorry, it's an article called Failed Squad Goals by Jeremiah Lee, written in 2020. And it's actually an investigation of what happened in Shopify, where they use a model there called the Shopify model, which is very, very similar to Scrum with different names. That's a very simple model. It turned out that even in Shopify, which invented that model, it's never actually been used really in that simple way. It's actually maybe, to use a word, a little bit naive in terms of what's actually required to do Agile at scale. So that's the first issue. We need to do some adaptations. Some other necessary ingredients. There's an argument about should Agile be a top-down versus a bottom-up initiative if you're trying to transition the organization over. The answer really is both. So we normally advise that you begin with a proof of concept, select a small number of teams to try out the approach if it's the first time it's being done in your organization. For many of you, this is not the case because you're already in mature organizations from the poll we just did, but hopefully you began that way. And then you get lessons learned from those few that begin, and it starts to bubble up from the bottom up, from a few teams doing it until you've got everybody doing. But the other side of the story is I've been in many organizations where they've done only that, and the problem with it is it's not sustainable. I can tell you that my own personal experience has been, in many cases, the director or the executive who has been pushing, or high-level manager who has been pushing their team or group of teams to work in this way, and they even established within an entire, in one case it was the entire credit card department of a bank, had established this way of working very early on. And yet if that person ever leaves, and shuffles are very common within organizations, unless there is a wider support for the approach, the whole approach can actually just fall flat, and the next person comes in and starts from scratch again. And that's why it's important as well to have top-down support, not just bottom-up. So it needs to be a very high-level executive decision to do this. It often requires not just time but money for the technical aspects, and so you need that support to sustain it over time. It's also true that to be successful, we need to look at I would say just three categories of areas that we have to hit. And if you only hit one of them, you're not going to be successful. Actually, of the three, and I know it's not popular to say this, I think actually that the technological and technical practices, the actual technology itself, even more so than the practices, is extremely, extremely important to get right. If you're unable within your organization, if you don't have the infrastructure to very frequently integrate code, run it through all of the testing, and even do all the provisioning very automatically at the press of a button, then if you don't have that capability, a lot of the other things that we're looking for in Agile aren't just going to be possible. I've also found that once the capability actually is there, people start to change their practices just because it isn't, the life cycle is so short that you can actually try something. Sorry, the development life cycle is what I mean. You can actually try something out and get a result quite quickly. So it encourages people to test things out versus doing too much on the planning side. And I've seen that myself in many, many situations. So that's processes and supporting technology. So we need the technology for that, and we need the processes to go along with that. We also have to have the right people in organization. So we need to look for people who are comfortable working in this way. People who've been working in waterfall for a long time can absolutely adapt to the new environment, but there are some people who will resist, and so that's and they can either be retrained, or we may need to have different people working on these projects. And then the way those people are organized also has to be done properly. Otherwise, the organization itself tends to slow things down. And the same is also true about the Agile culture. An example of that is if any of you are working in a shop where you're doing everything right, supposedly, you're using user stories, you've got daily stand-ups going every day for 15 minutes, just the way you're supposed to do it. You're doing all the stuff right, and yet you're not getting any of the agile results. You're not having short development cycles. You're not more responsive or more adaptive. If that's happening, it's often because the culture is getting in the way. So the question then is, why are we even having this discussion? If this book was actually 100% true, we should not be actually having this webinar right now. What we found out, however, is that it is not true. And I actually would recommend, I brought a couple of extra books along in case you'd like to have a look. Aside from my own book, of course, which goes into this in great detail in a few chapters, this is a really, really good case study book. It's called A Practical Approach to Large-Scale Agile Development, How HP Transformed LaserJet Future Smart Firmware by Gary Gruber, Young, and Fulgham. I recommend it highly because it actually looks at, it doesn't, I don't mention the Shopify model by name, but he looks at that model, which again is similar to the Scrum, the basic Scrum model. And they found that it doesn't scale on its own. And so why is that? Well, one of the aspects that is, core ideas behind that model is that, behind the simple Scrum model, is that all the teams are independent and they contain all of the competencies that are required to put out value. So, for example, you will see later on that we organize teams by sub-products or areas of the product that they work on. In theory, they should contain all of the expertise. And if true, wouldn't need to coordinate between teams because every team would have true. You wouldn't have all the capabilities they need to get value out. In other words, let's say to produce working software. Valuable actual practice, though. Those teams tend to be interconnected. They have dependencies between each other. And because of that, because they do have these dependencies, we have to put in mechanisms to deal with them. We can't just have everybody working on their own. So why is this true that they in fact aren't independent? That's because that when you're working on a large and a mature product, right, it's been out for a long time, you tend to have dependencies because of the features themselves. First of all, think about your iPhone. Your iPhone has a camera, it's got mail, it's got photo editing capabilities, it's got messaging capabilities, and all of these features are interconnected. You can be right in the middle of looking at photos and decide this photo is so good, I'd like to send it to somebody. And so immediately I go into send message. Every feature is interconnected, and that's what actually makes the phone or the product more powerful. This idea that sub aspects of the product, features of the product are connected applies to most mature systems. And if you keep in mind that you'll have a team or a group of teams working on each of these feature sets or each of these areas of the product, if the features themselves are interconnected, then when you make a change with one, you may have to make a change to another. That means interdependency. The second issue has to do with the complexity of the software itself, and even of the business rules that are behind that. When we're talking about a self-sufficient team, that would mean a lot of expertise, right? Think about all the different layers of software. You've got a UI layer. There's coding in various languages that are required, quite a few, usually for a typical product. Knowledge of how to use cloud services, the deployment framework, knowledge about automated testing. I could go on, database management, and then there's expertise about the business domains itself. It is very hard to get all of that expertise into a small, typical agile team of maximum about 10 members or so. You just can't fit it all in there. And so that means that we're likely going to have more than one team that have to work together just because of size. And then finally, it has to do with components or component teams. We often have software that we want to get right because everybody uses it. Maybe it's an interface to a third party application, or it's an interface to the database. So we create components for that. Instead of having every feature team deal with it on their own, a component involved. Sorry, system seems to be a little hung there. There we go. All right, so I'd like to talk a little bit now about the next thing, which is about enabling practices. So we said that we need to add a little bit more to our kit. Some of these practices are important regardless of size, but they become extremely important once we're dealing with a scaled operation. So the first of these practices is CICD. That stands for Continuous Integration, Continuous Delivery. What is the idea? That every change results in reliable, releasable version at the push of a button. By the way, that quote comes from DevOps.com, and that's because the DevOps framework, which we'll look at in a moment, includes CI/CD. And so the basic goal here is to deliver stories to the business in a near releasable state, right? As close as you can get to, you can actually just push it exactly the way it is right out there. So we talk about code that's integrated, it's been fully tested. In an environment like that, we can get integration a few times a day. And I'm sure many of you are working in environments like that right now. And a single branch lifespan, that refers to how long a programmer would be working on a section of code on their own without integrating it, can be as short as a few hours and up to a day typically, or maximum about 2 days. So we're really talking about near continuous integration. They're happening very, very frequently and reliably. Now, DevOps includes all these practices and also includes more. It emphasizes collaboration between developers and operations, hence the name DevOps. The idea is not just to automate integration, right, of the different little pieces, but also delivery and changes to infrastructure. So, for example, beyond testing and integration, we also have deployment, provision of IT services, the creation of virtual environments, handling of version control, which is a very, very complicated thing to get right. All of this is covered under DevOps, and the idea behind it is, the goal is that at a push of a button, you can integrate, deliver, and deploy new software safely, which is the key thing too, because yes, it's very easy to deploy things, but is it going to be safe? Now, one of the practices that's encompassed within this is ATDD. And so we'll just take a couple of moments to talk about that. TDD stands for Test-Driven Development, and that was the first of these approaches to come out. Basic idea was simple. If you're going to be developing code, you begin by writing the test for the code, and then running it. Now, since the code hasn't actually been written yet, that test will fail, and that's part of the process. The next step is to just enough coding for the test to pass. So you can see already that this is an incremental process. We don't code everything, we just try to pass that one test. We then refactor, we do some cleaning up because we don't want messy code to be building up. And then we repeat, then we write the next test and repeat. Now, you can see from this is a very, very developer, focused idea. And so acceptance test-driven development took this idea and just pushed it a little bit further and said, let's not, test-driven development is about testing units of code. So you'll be testing, for those of you who are coders, a software class or an operation of a software class. We call that unit acceptance test driven development takes that same concept and says, let's apply that concept not just to software units, which at that level, it's something that only other programmers really look at. And let's take it up a notch to requirements units. For example, user stories or use cases if you're using that approach. In other words, let's take the same process, write acceptance tests before coding begins. Then we'll do just enough implementation and coding for that to work, for that test to pass. And then let's work on the next test. So that's the basic idea. And what's really, really key here is that you're writing those acceptance tests, and they may include a UI or they may fake the UI part. And you're writing that just before people start developing. Now we have this other concept that came up around the same time, this idea of behavior-driven development, which is related, and that's why I put them together. It was created by Dan North. He introduced this in an article in March of 2006. And he was working with TDD, and he said, you know, what if I play with things and I change the language, I change the names that I give these tests, and I use a language that makes people think about the behaviors of the system versus thinking about these primarily as test cases, and that the language that I use should be a natural language so that anybody who looks at it would be able to read and understand it. Wouldn't that be a great thing, because it would enhance communication? So that was the original idea behind it, and over time, and this was way back still in 2006, B2D has grown to encompass this wider picture of agile analysis and automated acceptance testing. So a great overlap with what we're talking about today. So what does all this stuff mean? If we could summarize everything that comes from these practices and focusing on what's important to us from a product ownership analysis point of view, this is what it means to be practicing ATDD, BDD. First of all, we specify the acceptance tests before implementation begins. That's a key idea, because that is what gets everybody on the same page from the outset. We already know what we are aiming towards, because if the system does the product satisfies the acceptance criteria, it is behaving functionally correctly, right? So it is actually following the requirements. The second idea is to use specific scenarios. We've been finding over time, and if you know about this idea of specification by example, it's all about that by using specific scenarios, we can drive out the requirements much better than if we just try to talk about generalized rules. So the idea is to specify specific cases which illustrate the different business rules. And by the way, this is an important thing to do, but I don't want to give the impression that business rules documentation is not important. We often supplement that with business rules documentation, because that gives you the overall picture about why these scenarios behave as they do. So specify tests before coding, use specific scenarios. Third point, use a structured natural language to describe those tests / requirements, because we think of them as being similar. There is a Gherkin language, which is very widely used. When BDD first came out, it already came out with that language, although I'm not sure if the name Gherkin was given to it. And if you've heard about the given, when, then, that's what that's all about. We're actually going to see an example of that. So that's important too, because by using a structured natural language, this is something that not only coders can understand, but also business subject matter experts. Next, do all of this through a collaboration of the triad and the analyst. The triad refers to three perspectives that should be involved when we're dealing with features. One perspective is the business perspective, exemplified by the product owner or a proxy or subject matter experts. We also want the developer's point of view, because the business knows what it wants and how prioritized it is, whereas the developer knows how much it's going to cost to actually do it, and it makes just some workarounds as well. And then we have QA to help us with articulating the test cases that would actually test this properly. So that's important as well. And then finally, using an iterative incremental approach. We don't try to get all of the acceptance criteria up front, if fully elaborated up front, that would ever possibly be needed for the feature. We try to focus mostly on the highest value scenarios, specify those, and most importantly, start working on implementing them first. and then we start to add in others. And then keeping in mind that's an iterative incremental approach, what that means is that the team is collaborating every day to build the right product in small slices. So each of these slices is a little piece of the feature. So I mentioned this minimum marketable feature idea that has to do with this iterative approach. So let's just pause for a second to talk about that. So MMF, if you've seen it, stands for minimum marketable feature. And here's what it is: the smallest version of a feature that would be viewed as valuable by customers if it were released to the market. So an MMF is not the same as an MVP, for those of you who might be asking about that. The purpose of an MVP, minimum viable product, despite the name, is really for testing an idea out in the market. It's really an experiment. But the MMF is really a full enough version of the feature that we actually could release it to the market. So what is in that minimum marketable feature? What are we specifying for the feature? The highest value aspects of the feature. Differentiating capabilities, aspects that make the product different, your product different from everybody else's, aspects that reduce time-consuming activities. I mentioned here an example of Trint. Trint, a software application developed for journalists, and it focuses on or at least the first versions of it focused on the transcription of video to text. And so that was the most time-consuming aspect. And some of the editing that happened afterwards to make sure that the transcription is correct and so on, the final touch-up, that they left for human intervention because it was less time-consuming. And then we also look at requirements that are very frequently used. So for example, if you're working on an incident management system, you might look at the types of incidents that are taking up most of the time of the people who are in support. And your minimum marketable feature might focus on those incidents at the expense of others. And finally, we're looking for ways to deliver a quick win. We're looking for features and aspects of features that can actually be done very quickly to demonstrate, to the business that we've actually got something, good here, and also something that they can start to play with and we can learn from, but through their interactions. So sort of the theory behind all of this is to view each feature as a hypothesis. What do I mean by that? I mean that even if the customer thinks they really want a feature, we view it as a hypothesis that the feature has value. It's a hypothesis that needs to be proven through experimentation. And so we try the feature, we try different ways of doing the feature, and we do A/B testing to determine whether or not we're actually getting the desired result. And for those who don't know, A/B testing really means we take one group and we expose them to a change. We take a control group who is not exposed to the change, and we see whether or not we get an improvement in the desired metrics in the change version versus the control. And you can also use this with ABC, for example, compare option A versus option B versus doing nothing. And if this is actually a new product, if you take all of those minimum marketable features and add them all up, you get the minimum marketable product. And the minimum marketable product is the version of the product as a whole that would be releasable if it were available and would be viewed as valuable by the customers. So why are we using these practices? I want to sort of summarize what the overall benefits are of doing this sort of ATDD/BDD/MMF. What does it do for us, particularly when we're scaling Agile? Well, the first thing is it enables frequent, reliable integration and delivery across teams. When you've got many teams, it's extremely important to have continuous integration, to have the work of those teams integrated frequently. So actually one of the big lessons from this book here, large-scale Agile development that came out of the HP experience and others. And ATD BDD helps us because we're actually writing the integration tests before the software is developed. So we know that they're going to be written. We're applying them and running them every time a unit of code has been changed. And so and we're creating automated tests along the way. So that's how it's helping us with that. And not only that, but the tests that we create the first time around when we're developing a feature, because they're automated, they can be reused. In fact, they are reused. The intention is to reuse them over and over and over again for regression testing. Because we are developing through this process a bigger and bigger bed that can be used for testing, it's very, very easy now to make changes reliably because the tests that are required for regression testing to make sure that we didn't break something while trying to fix something over here, they're already there. And so basically, as a result of this practice, what you get is a steady stream of current requirements and tests. You know they're current because they were actually written just before development began, and we know they're reliable. And so as a result of all of this, one of the other benefits we get is it reduces rework due to errors. One of the big problems that we have is you've got many teams working on a similar or different aspects of an issue. When you put all that work together, there are inconsistencies. If we have common communication beforehand, there's going to be, and we've clarified what the acceptance criteria are beforehand, less chance that any single team is going to make an error. And because we're doing continuous integration, less chance that when we integrate the work across teams, we're going to get a problem. If we do have a problem, we'll notice it very, very quickly when it's easier to fix. We get increased maintainability because the language that we're using for the acceptance criteria is business language, and that language permeates all the way down to the actual code. So it's very easy to find areas that need to be fixed when that happens. Another benefit is that we find that specifying by examples I mentioned earlier, it tends to be better than abstractions and working out what the business rules and requirements really are. And because we are focusing with our minimum marketable feature approach on the most valuable acceptance criteria first, this is what enables quick wins because we're not trying to do the whole feature all at once. Now, how does this relate to you or I as product owners or as business analysts? Who does what with respect to acceptance test-driven development and BDD? It varies widely by the organization. There's no law about this. But in general, what I find is that you're going to find either the BA might own the feature files as a whole. These feature files are the files in where the acceptance criteria are specified for a feature. So that whole file could be owned by the BA, or it could be that the team as a whole collectively owns it. You also might find that when you get down to the details of who does what, very often you might find the BA writing the acceptance criteria, including scenario titles, which are a textual version of the scenarios in totally free-form text, as well as the Gherkin specifications that are written in that much tighter style, given, when, then. Alternatively, you might be working in an organization where you just write the free-form stuff as a business analyst, so the acceptance criteria and these scenario titles that are free-form. And when it gets down to the more detailed Gherkin specifications, I've said testers. By that I mean the person responsible for testing, or people, write the Gherkin specifications. I use that phraseology because increasingly what we're looking for really is for the developers who write the code to actually write the test cases, so they serve a dual function. And so here is an example of what I've been talking about, specifying acceptance criteria using this approach. So here we have an example. As a planner, I want to enable drop ship product identification so I can increase sales without the inventory expense. Example that came out from one of my clients, just sort of made it a little bit more anonymous. Totally free form for the feature. There's a description of what this feature is about drop ship products that allows allows a company to offer products without keeping those products in inventory, because when somebody orders them, the order goes directly to the supplier. So that's what the background behind this. And then I have here eligible product success. You notice that everything that I've done up until now has been in quite free form text. And this might be everything that's done by a business analyst. And the part that comes up from this point on is might be a business analyst, or it might be developer/tester. And so what happens here, this is that scenario written in the more formal format. Given that I am signed in as Jane Tyndall, when I query product so-and-so, then I should see a message that the product is dropship eligible. What do we have here? We have a given that gives us the preconditions for the test, the setup. when I query product so-and-so, gives us the trigger for the test, what is actually happening during this scenario, in other words, what the trigger was or what the user has done. And then the then is the expected outcome. And it could be anything here. Here I should see a message that the product is dropship eligible. That's a very simple example. We don't have time here to do a whole IIBA, sorry, a whole BDD course, but I just wanted to give you just so you can see it, what a more complicated example would look like. What we have here is that this is an example for renewing a license for a tested vehicle. And what's different about this is that the given when then is written once, but then all of the different inputs that I would be wanting to put in there are listed in the little table afterwards. And this is all part of the format of BDD. So it basically allows me to talk about one kind of a scenario, but not have to rewrite the whole thing over and over again when the only thing that's changing are the actual inputs. So having said that, we'll want to take just a few minutes giving you for what it means to scale the organization along with these ideas and to scale the process, a little bit about planning and culture. So this is an example of a, let's say, a typical, a possible typical scaled organization. And what I wanted to give you, wanted to focus here is that the idea behind this is what you're seeing here is each of these boxes represents an organizational unit. They're big units until you finally get down to where it says a feature team / team POs, where we're now down at the team level. So each one of these teams at that bottom level is focused on a specific area of functionality of the product. It's a sub-product, might be a set of use cases, feature set, or even a particular feature. Then we bundle up, and the idea, of course, is that each of these feature teams has all the capabilities that it needs to get the job done, but we've seen that's not entirely true. They're going to need a little bit of help. A little bit above that, we have product. Now, by the way, each of these teams would have either a product owner, a team product owner, or we often have someone called a proxy product owner who acts in place of the product owner. So something similar to that. And by the way, in your own experience, lots of different possibilities for the names of these roles. I don't want to get into too much because there's just so many different permutations on that. Now, above all, you might have a whole bunch of these or a number of these feature teams that are gathered together to serve a higher purpose, they're all sort of basic features of a sub-product of the main product. So in this particular case, I've got a chatbot which has some primary usages broken down to sales, marketing, using a chatbot for support, using a chatbot for analytics, and each of those is broken down into product areas. So the using a chatbot for support and engagement is broken down into different areas, using it to help collaboration among support staff, using it to ingest content, using it to improve users' efficiency. And then finally, this collaboration tool automation is broken down into individual features, individual teams that can work on aspects of the collaboration. So think of it as the sub-products are very, very large use cases, very high-level use cases for the product, and we get down to lower and lower sort of use cases for using the product. And you'll notice that at the bottom here, just aside from all these feature teams, or these other kinds of teams, or other groups or teams, we've got shared resources. There will be business subject matter experts that aren't attached to maybe a single team, but are shared amongst a group of teams. We'll look at that in a moment. We have competency groups that we've got possibly groups that have competencies in different technical aspects and also different business rules or different aspects of the business. They feed people to the teams, to the feature teams. And then we have component teams that may be sitting on their own as actual teams that the feature teams have to integrate with, the way that we were discussing earlier. And so if you look at a typical feature team, the basic team, it would be led by a proxy product owner or a BA or maybe even a product owner. And this is just an example, by the way, not a rule. There might be 3 or 4 full-time developers on that team who are fully attached to that team 24/7. And we may have an extended team, and we often do. Other people that are added into the team but are shared, that aren't exclusive to our one team, but might be shared amongst a group of related teams Who would that include? People from marketing and business that come from that product competency group. We might have a dev manager. One of the lessons that was learned from that HP experience was that it really, really helps to have a development manager, so a product owner doesn't have to talk to, 8 or 9 people on the team to discuss things like how long is this going to take, and to negotiate some changes. They should only have to do that with one person. They found that was very useful. If there's going to be any user interface aspects to the feature or the change, in other words, it's anything other than an internal one, you're probably going to need a UX person. That's somebody experienced in or competent in user experience to design the screens and so on. We may need some DevOps support and component support if we need to use some of these software components as well as part of if the feature needs to talk to them, and we need either expertise about the components or we need to make some changes to those components. And so that's the organization. What about the process itself? So again, the process is very, very, showing this book again, very simple in Scrum. There are basically a few types of meetings, like the daily stand-up. You've got sprint planning, sprint retro, sprint demo, and with a few of these very simple procedures or ceremonies they're referred to in Scrum, you can get the whole process is basically covered. When we're dealing with larger situations, that's not enough usually. And so this graphic here gives us a kind of an overview of what a typical process would look like in a scaled organization. And so let's say we're beginning a new product or a major change to a new product. There'll be some initial preparation, determining what some of the major features are going to be, what the vision for this new product or this major new version of the product is going to be, and so on. So that's just some initial startup. If this product is going to be developed over a number of quarters, and every quarter, every 3 months or so, there's going to be some quarterly planning for that quarter. Then at the beginning of, and in that scaled quarterly planning, by the way, we would have all of the teams that are involved in the change or in the product development would be involved in that process. Next, we get into iteration by iteration. I use the word iteration to mean a sprint. So as you probably recall, sprint planning in Scrum has a number of parts to it. By the way, in the new Scrum guide, there's actually 3 full parts to iteration planning. So in the first aspect of iteration planning, however you want to break that down, it's all about determining what are the goals going to be. That's one of the parts for the sprint, and which stories are we going to develop during the sprint. That type of work requires everybody, so everybody gets together for that piece. And then the next part of sprint planning traditionally is to figure out how we're going to do it. What are the individual developer tasks that have to get done to get the job done? There's a discussion about that happens as well. That happens on a team by team level. That's why you see these individual boxes are meant to get that idea across. And then every day there's a daily stand-up meeting that happens at the team level. The recommendation these days is not to do a scrum of scrums across all teams, but to use other mechanisms for that. On a continual basis, we're analyzing, building, testing, and delivering stories following the continuous integration idea. And then as each feature comes up, because I'm defining features as something that requires more than one team to work on, this is something we discussed last time around, then we'll need to do some preparation initially by getting all the teams together. For example, just to make sure that all the teams that are working on that feature are actually committed to the feature and that they have a shared understanding of the feature. And then each team, then we break down that feature into individual stories, and you might have possibly different teams working on different stories of the feature. And so that's why I have that broken down by individual boxes. At the end of a sprint, we typically have a scaled sprint review or iteration review. It is something that we do together with all of the teams because there really is only one product, one integrated product across teams. And so that's what we want to demo and review. And then in terms of retrospectives, there are parts that are recommended generally to do as a group and as a team. And then finally, a retrospective at the quarterly basis. All of these I go into in heavy, heavy detail in the book, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what's sort of involved. And over on the right are meetings that are held intermittently, product owner council meetings, integration meetings, pruning and ordering, and so on and so on. We don't have time to do them all, but I'll focus on the product owner council meeting a little bit.
And I
So
just
let's have a
wanted to
look at
give
that.
you a little time
Here's
check,
an example of
Howard.
I guess, a typical product owner council. Again, no law about this. The names of these roles will change by organization and even the composition, but it gives you an idea of what it might look like. The purpose of the meeting is to we hold this meeting regularly. You do it before a quarter as part of quarterly planning, and then once things get rolling, at least once a week. In SAFE, they refer to this as the PO sync. And the purpose is to align the vision and prioritization of work across teams. And if there are conflicts about priorities, like team one really wants to push for A and team two wants to push for B, it's during the product owner council meeting that we try to resolve those. And so this is, you'll see a sort of a leveled idea here. We've got a number of teams, and each with its own team PO or proxy PO, and then there is a senior person above all of those who acts as the senior PO. I refer to that person here as a senior product manager, but again, the names may differ. Similarly, across all of the teams, each team has a development manager with this particular scheme who is helping to organize the work of the developers within the team. And there's a senior development manager who is across all of those teams within that group. And should a senior development manager and the senior product manager not agree about, let's say, which types of stories, technical versus feature stories, should be prioritized, the product champion then has the final say. And then in terms of quarterly planning, what's involved there, because we are now talking about more long-term planning for a larger project, a longer project. So that we're now talking about a planning horizon roughly about a quarter, which means 3 months roughly. When I say roughly, I mean, yes, we could be referring to a release cycle as well, which might be not 3 months, but maybe it's 2 months, maybe it's 3 or 4 months. And if we're using the SAFE methodology, we would refer to that as a program increment or a PI, and that's roughly equivalent to a quarter as well. And there's a little definition there for those of you who are into SAFE. Roughly about 8 to 12 weeks, so it gives you an idea of the number of iterations if you think about each sprint being about 2 weeks. And what comes out of this whole process? There'll be a roadmap describing what is going to be accomplished when, a vision statement to explain what the vision, what we're trying to achieve, what we're trying to get to through this change, a timeline which shows visually when the milestones will be reached, story map, which gives us a picture of what will happen during each sprint of the release cycle or of the quarter. And it gives us quite an interesting picture, which we'll show you in a few moments. A program board, which shows something similar and includes showing dependencies between teams, and then a quarterly backlog, which is basically a list of all the features and stories that are going to be developed during that quarter. And so some of the general principles are as follows, because there is an inherent contradiction with planning for Agile. So the first thing to get across is that the plan is an estimate only. Remember that in Agile, we're expecting change, and we're in fact don't feel negatively about that. We want to incorporate change as best we can. And so in order to do that, we have to make it clear that the plan is only a best estimate based upon existing knowledge. It's worth planning, but the business needs to understand there could be changes. We're hoping to make adjustments based on what we learn during the quarter. As well, because we're often doing Agile development because the product itself is unknowable at the start. There might be so many new innovations in that product that we really can't decide in advance which are going to be the most important to users because users haven't actually used them before. We plan experiments. So part of the planning itself is not, oh, I've got all these features and this is the plan to do them. Yeah, that's part of it, but part of the plan is to actually determine what those features actually have to be. And these experiments to determine what the features are, they're called MVPs or minimum viable products. And finally, we try to focus our commitment on outcomes business outcomes, like for example, better conversion rate of browsers to shoppers versus outputs, versus you will have this feature, or this feature. And that's the focus of our commitment in Agile. So I mentioned this idea
So,
of MVP planning.
Howard,
I'm sure many of you know about it, but I just wanted to give you an idea what this is then. It means uh, testing hypotheses. So an MVP is an experimental version of a product, and the purpose is to test an idea that we have, a theory, and to deliver some learning. In other words, so that by the end of the MVP test, we'll know something that we did not know before. The whole idea behind it is to short circuit the ramp by killing things that don't make sense fast and doubling down on the ones that do. In other words, if we have an idea that something might be valuable, we just test it out in the marketplace. And if it looks good, then we develop it for real. And otherwise, we may decide just to drop it or do something different, pivot this to another approach. I've got a few examples
I think
here.
we
I'll just talk
lost.
about one of them right now. Google rightly was an example. It was an example of a product that would allow you to share documents over the cloud. It did not do a lot of things that Word does, even though it's meant to be a cloud text editor. But in the first versions of the MVP, it really focused on the sharing aspects, because that's where you're going to
All right, I'm just going to turn off your
build
web camera
a
just to make
solid
sure that your
group of
audio
early
stays with
evangelists, and it's
us.
also where you're going to test your hypothesis. That's a roadmap. This is an example here. We just have various release dates up along the top and release names throughout. So basically every column here represents a, oh, I'm sorry. I noticed here that my webcam is not being shared. Can I just, is
I would
everybody
suggest
seeing
you
that?
keep that off just because you are
Hello?
having some audio issues.
In
This is
case
just
you're
to
not
make
seeing it,
sure
I'll just sort of
that you're sounding
describe what
okay.
I'm looking at. I'm looking at columns, and in every column represents a period of time. It could be a sprint, or if it's a larger roadmap, it could be an entire release cycle. And during each of these, we've got the goals that we're trying to accomplish, the assumptions that are being tested because of this very, assumption testing MVP approach that we're using, the metrics that we're going to use to test the assumption, milestones, and features. On the next slide here, I have a program board. This is an artifact that comes out of SAFe, and it's very, very similar to what you saw earlier. Each iteration, we're showing what's going to be accomplished, but I'm breaking it down now by team so we know which team is going to be delivering which of those features or stories. And we have these little red strings here that are meant to show dependencies between items. And then finally, the story map that I talked about earlier has this added thing that when you read the story map from left to right, it not only, it shows us the order in which these stories are probably going to be executed when the user actually has them available. So this story map basically breaks down into very large feature use cases up along the top in the order in which they would happen. Here I have the story of what happens to a claim from the time a customer submits it until it's fully adjudicated. I break down each of these features as too much work to do in a single story within a single sprint by a single team. And so these yellow items down below are the actual stories that are going to be used, that are going to be developed. And each iteration gives us an idea. Each row tells us when it's going to be developed. And finally, just a few words on Agile culture before we finish, because I did mention that you can get all the details right, but you can fall flat because you got the culture wrong. So it's just some I've listed here, and in the book is a full explanation of the 13 principles or practices for an agile culture. The most important one is the one we talked about last time, iterative experimentation, a culture that encourages you to experiment rather than to do extensive planning in order to prove a hypothesis. Acceleration, also extremely important, because when we're developing something innovative, we often have a small grace period where the competition won't notice, particularly if it's a low-end disruption. But we have to be prepared to accelerate very, very quickly should we need to react fast, otherwise maybe because our competitor is catching up to us. Responsible procrastination, another important aspect as well, where we basically leave decisions as long as possible before making them, because the longer we wait, the more chance that we have of having current information. And finally, just one final word, distributed authority, an octopus model, which basically says that the self-organizing principle of Scrum needs some adaptation. We don't have every team, the teams making entirely decisions on their own. The team needs to have some sort of leader who provides a vision, who can translate the vision down to the team level and make tactical decisions. And so we basically are looking for something that's a little bit of a combination where the vision is set from on high, and the team makes local tactical decisions. And I've compared it to an octopus, which according to some theories, has one central brain to decide things like, for example, I want food, but each tentacle makes a decision about how to do that based upon local decisions. And that, folks, is mostly what I wanted to get across today. Just to remind you again that all this explained more fully in the book. So I hope that you've whet your appetite. As well, we don't just make books here, but should you need any help actually in coaching or training your organization, I'd be happy to come out and help you with that as well. We have courses and so on that are approved by IIBA towards certification. So thank you, everybody. I'll turn the tables over to Tiffany right now. It's been a real pleasure working with you. I've only really actually got a couple of minutes to finish off here because I have a hard stop. Thanks, everybody, for listening. If there are questions that you have that aren't addressed, please submit them. I've actually been keeping a list of them, and I might supply a document to Tiffany that can be passed around to everybody who was here afterwards. So thanks, everyone, and hope to see you again.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you to everyone who took some time for being here today. We will send a follow-up email to you, so feel free to
Tiffany, if you're there, I can't hear you.
Oh, my apologies. There seems to be some connection issues today, but I hope our attendees on the line can hear me. We did run short on time, but we will send a follow-up email to you to answer any questions you've submitted. And if you have any questions, feel free to respond at that time. And thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
I seem to have lost the screen, folks. So